Rodrigo Duterte, the fiery former president of the Philippines, vanished without a trace, leaving the nation in chaos. His daughter, Sara Duterte, stepped into the spotlight, accusing international powers of conspiring to eliminate her father. What followed was a web of lies, political intrigue, and shocking truths that would change everything, revealing not just a political struggle, but a fight for survival on a global stage. Would the world ever learn what really happened to Duterte? Or was this just the beginning of a dangerous new chapter? Rodrigo Duterte, the controversial former president of the Philippines, was known for his tough stance on crime and his brutal war on drugs, which divided public opinion both domestically and internationally. However, in a shocking turn of events, he disappeared without a trace. The once loud and unapologetic leader vanished from the public eye, leaving a nation in turmoil. This sudden disappearance was not just a personal loss for his family, but a national crisis that sparked widespread rumors and speculations. His supporters believed that Duterte had been silenced by foreign powers who could no longer tolerate his defiance, while his critics saw it as karma for the violence that had marked his presidency. Theories about his disappearance flooded the media. Some speculated that Duterte had been kidnapped by rival political factions within the Philippines who feared his return to power. Others hinted at darker, more sinister possibilities involving foreign governments, particularly the United States, which had clashed with Duterte over his approach to drug laws and his frequent criticism of Western influence in the Philippines. Was he in hiding, or had something far worse happened? No one knew for sure, and the government's response was frustratingly vague. In the midst of this uncertainty, Sara Duterte, his eldest daughter, and a rising political figure in her own right, emerged as the only spokesperson for the family. She was thrust into the limelight, with the public eagerly awaiting her every word. As days turned into weeks, the pressure mounted. Sara's statements were cautious, leaving more questions than answers. But with each passing day, it became clear that this wasn't just the disappearance of a politician. It was the beginning of a much larger, more complex story involving international intrigue, power struggles, and a web of conspiracies that stretched far beyond the borders of the Philippines. Months after her father's sudden disappearance, Sara Duterte stood before the public to deliver a speech that would leave the nation in shock. Her words, filled with raw emotion, seemed to reveal more about the dark forces at play than anyone had expected. Sara had always been known for her strength, but this moment marked a turning point in her journey. She spoke not just of her father's absence, but of a hidden truth that few dared to acknowledge: the powerful international forces that were allegedly behind his disappearance. With unflinching resolve, she revealed that the International Criminal Court, ICC, had been investigating her father, focusing on the human rights abuses associated with his war on drugs. But what caught the world's attention was her claim that the United States had been working behind the scenes, actively seeking to bring about Duterte's downfall and even orchestrating his death. The world listened in disbelief. Why would the U.S., a longtime ally of the Philippines, want to kill Duterte? His presidency had been marked by fierce opposition to Western influence, especially America's military presence in the region. His defiant stance on various issues, including his open criticism of U.S. foreign policy, had strained relations between the two nations. But as Sara's speech continued, it became evident that her words were part of a larger narrative, one that intertwined the fate of her father with global geopolitics. Sara's claim was not just about politics. It was about survival. Her speech was an urgent cry for help, a plea for the world to understand that her father's disappearance wasn't an isolated event. It was a symptom of a much larger struggle for power, both within the Philippines and on the global stage. The questions that followed were impossible to ignore. Was her father really a victim of international power games? And if so, who would be the next target? The announcement of the International Criminal Court, ICC, investigation into Rodrigo Duterte's administration had already placed his government under immense scrutiny. The ICC had launched a formal inquiry into the alleged extrajudicial killings that occurred during his controversial war on drugs. From the very beginning of his presidency, Duterte had declared war on narcotics, and the bodies began to pile up. Thousands of suspects killed in encounters with law enforcement, many without trial or proper legal process. The world reacted. With condemnation, human rights organizations accused Duterte of committing crimes against humanity, and the ICC's investigation seemed like an inevitable next step. But Sara Duterte's revelation took things to another level entirely. She suggested that her father's disappearance was directly tied to these international investigations, particularly the ICC's growing pressure on his government. It wasn't just about legal proceedings. There was a deeper, more dangerous game at play. Sara hinted that the investigation was part of a larger geopolitical agenda aimed at destabilizing the Philippines, with Duterte positioned as a target for those who wanted to see his administration fall. While she didn't provide concrete evidence, the timing of her speech suggested that something far more sinister was unfolding behind the scenes. The ICC was relentless in its pursuit of accountability for Duterte's war on drugs. And as international tensions escalated, Sara's speech hinted at a coordinated effort by powerful global players. As she spoke, it became clear that the legal investigation was not the only pressure her father had faced. The stakes were higher than just human rights violations. Duterte's independent foreign policy, his increasingly adversarial relationship with the United States, and his refusal to bow to Western influence made him an outcast in the eyes of powerful foreign governments. And as the investigation unfolded, many began to ask the question, was the ICC simply doing its job? Or were international forces using it as a tool to remove a leader they could no longer control? Sara Duterte's claim that the United States had a hand in her father's disappearance was a bold accusation, but as the investigation deepened, some began to entertain the possibility that there was truth to her words. Rodrigo Duterte's presidency had been marked by frequent clashes with Washington, particularly over his harsh war on drugs and his stance on U.S. military presence in the Philippines. Duterte had repeatedly criticized the U.S., calling out its interference in Philippine sovereignty and accusing it of being an imperialist force in Southeast Asia. His decision to pivot towards China, forging stronger ties with Beijing, only heightened the tensions between him and the U.S. Duterte's open defiance had unsettled many in Washington. His unpredictable foreign policy, which included threatening to terminate military agreements with the U.S., and his vocal disdain for American influence, made him a problematic ally. There were whispers within political circles in the U.S. that Duterte's unorthodox leadership style was destabilizing the region and undermining American interests in Asia. As Sara's speech continued to circulate, people began to wonder if the United States, a global superpower with a history of covert operations to remove leaders it considered a threat, could have played a role in her father's sudden disappearance. The possibility of foreign intervention was not far-fetched. The U.S. had a history of involvement in the political affairs of other nations, particularly in cases where it felt its interests were at risk. But Sara's claim went even further, suggesting that the U.S. had actively sought her father's death. This would not be the first time that a leader's opposition to American influence had resulted in a dramatic fallout. Could the U.S. have been willing to go so far to remove Duterte from power? And if they had, would they stop there? The fear began to spread that Duterte's disappearance was just one part of a larger, more dangerous game. As the mystery surrounding Rodrigo Duterte's disappearance deepened, the investigation revealed an intricate web of power struggles that extended far beyond the borders of the Philippines. Sara Duterte's speech had ignited suspicions, but it was the mounting evidence from various whistleblowers, insiders, and former associates of Duterte's administration that began to paint a much darker picture. With each revelation, the narrative that her father's disappearance was a result of political conspiracy gained more credibility. Rumors began circulating about a covert network of powerful figures, both within the Philippines and abroad, who stood to lose everything if Duterte continued his aggressive policies. The war on drugs had shaken up entrenched systems of corruption and criminal organizations, some of which had links to powerful elites, including politicians and business magnates. These individuals, who had enjoyed the protection of Duterte's predecessors, found themselves vulnerable under his administration. As Duterte's popularity grew, so did the number of enemies he made, and some of these enemies were more than willing to take extreme measures to remove him from power. Internationally, there were suspicions that certain governments, especially in the West, were part of the plot to bring down Duterte. Sara's mention of the United States wanting to see her father dead wasn't just an inflammatory statement. It was a key piece in understanding the full scope of the conspiracy. The Philippines, under Duterte's leadership, had moved away from traditional alliances with the U.S. and sought to strengthen ties with China. This shift was seen as a threat by many in Washington, particularly those who viewed China's growing influence in the region as a challenge to American dominance. As the pieces began to fit together, it became clear that Duterte's disappearance was not a simple case of a leader stepping down or fleeing. It was part of a high-stakes game of political chess, involving both local and international actors who would stop at nothing to maintain their control. Sara's speech had shone a light on this complex network, but the true depth of the conspiracy was still far from fully understood. The question on everyone's mind now was, how far were these forces willing to go to keep Duterte silenced, and who would be next? As Sara Duterte's speech reverberated across the nation, the reaction from the Filipino people was one of deep division. For many of Duterte's supporters, his disappearance was an extension of the battle he had fought throughout his presidency, a war against the corrupt elite, both in the Philippines and abroad. These supporters rallied behind Sara, believing her to be a beacon of truth in a sea of political maneuvering. To them, her accusations of foreign interference and the ICC's overreach were a powerful reminder of the forces that had long conspired against her father. They saw her as a symbol of resistance, and the speech became a rallying cry for those who felt their leader had been unjustly targeted. Protests erupted in the streets, with citizens demanding answers, demanding justice, and demanding the return of their president. On the other hand, critics of Duterte seized on Sara's words to further their argument that her father had brought this upon himself. To them, his aggressive stance on drugs and his disregard for international law were the very reasons why he had disappeared. They argued that the allegations against him, ranging from human rights violations to corruption, could no longer be ignored, and that Sara's claims were merely an attempt to deflect attention from the truth. The streets were filled with both fervent support and staunch opposition, with each side accusing the other of spreading dangerous misinformation. It was clear that the nation was on the brink of a new chapter, one where the rift between Duterte's loyalists and detractors could no longer be bridged. In the midst of this turmoil, Sara remained steadfast. Her speech, though controversial, had shaken the foundations of the political landscape. It forced the public to confront uncomfortable questions. Was Duterte truly the victim of international powers conspiring to eliminate him, or was he simply a casualty of his own reckless decisions? For Sara, it seemed that the battle was no longer just about her father's disappearance. It was about the future of the Philippines itself, and the fight for truth in a time of deep uncertainty. As the investigation into Rodrigo Duterte's disappearance advanced, more unsettling details began to emerge, hinting at a conspiracy that stretched across national borders and involved powerful actors with their own vested interests. Sara Duterte's speech had sparked a global wave of curiosity, but it was the growing network of whistleblowers and insiders that started to piece together the true extent of what had transpired. While the public focused on the political motivations behind Duterte's disappearance, those closer to the inner workings of his government began to reveal disturbing truths about the connections between local elites and international organizations. It became increasingly clear that Duterte's anti-corruption stance had not only alienated corrupt officials within the Philippines, but had also placed him at odds with transnational criminal networks. These networks, some of which had deep ties with high-ranking politicians and business figures, had benefited immensely from the status quo. Duterte's efforts to disrupt the flow of illegal drugs and dismantle criminal cartels had made him powerful enemies, both within the country and abroad. But the allegations against him, which painted him as a tyrant, were perhaps the least of his concerns. His actions had threatened the economic and political power of some of the world's most influential players. Sara's assertions about foreign powers, particularly the United States, seemed less like mere accusations and more like a revelation of a complex geopolitical struggle. Washington's frustration with Duterte's independent foreign policy, which increasingly aligned with China, was no secret. But the possibility that the U.S. might resort to covert means to eliminate him added a chilling layer to the unfolding story. As the investigation unraveled further, one thing became clear. Duterte's disappearance wasn't just a personal or political crisis. It was a strategic move in a high-stakes game involving the Philippines, global powerhouses, and clandestine networks. The more Sara spoke out, the more she exposed the undercurrents of international power struggles. Her father's war on drugs had undoubtedly rattled local elites, but it was his defiance of the global order that may have sealed his fate. And as the truth began to surface, it was clear that the shadows of power extended far beyond what anyone had initially imagined. In a surprising twist, a former U.S. diplomat emerged as an unexpected key player in the investigation into Rodrigo Duterte's disappearance. This diplomat, a woman who had been stationed in the Philippines during Duterte's presidency, came forward with startling claims. Despite the tense relationship between Duterte and the United States, she revealed that she had attempted to warn Duterte about growing threats to his life long before his sudden disappearance. According to her, American officials were quietly discussing how to deal with the Duterte problem and had begun to see the Philippine leader as an obstacle to U.S. influence in the region. This diplomat's account suggested that the pressure on Duterte was mounting not only from his own government, but from powerful foreign interests who viewed his policies as a direct challenge to their geopolitical strategy. While she didn't offer concrete evidence of a direct plot to kill Duterte, she hinted at a broader narrative of covert operations and backdoor dealings aimed at weakening his position. The diplomat claimed that her warnings fell on deaf ears, as Duterte's defiance only grew, leading to a dangerous escalation in tensions between the U.S. and the Philippines. Her revelation added another layer of complexity to the unfolding drama. It was no longer just about the actions of the ICC or political opponents within the Philippines. It was now clear that international forces, including the United States, had been actively involved in a behind-the-scenes campaign to undermine Duterte's power. But the question remained: had the U.S. government taken the steps to eliminate Duterte entirely, or was his disappearance the result of a more complicated series of events that involved multiple actors? As the diplomat's statements gained traction, the narrative that Sara Duterte had proposed in her speech seemed less like a conspiracy theory and more like a legitimate look into a web of international intrigue. With this new testimony, the story of Duterte's disappearance was no longer confined to the Philippines. It had become a matter of global stakes, one that threatened to expose a level of political maneuvering and covert action rarely seen in public view. After months of intense investigation, public pressure, and growing speculation, the truth about Rodrigo Duterte's disappearance was finally revealed in a shocking turn of events. It wasn't the outcome that many had feared, that he had been killed by international forces or disappeared at the hands of his political enemies, but instead, the startling reality was that Duterte had orchestrated his own vanishing act. He wasn't dead. He wasn't kidnapped. In fact, Duterte had gone into hiding, choosing to disappear from the public eye in order to protect himself from the mounting threats on his life. The revelation sent shockwaves through the nation and the world. The truth had been carefully hidden, with only a handful of trusted allies aware of Duterte's decision to step out of the spotlight. In a final attempt to safeguard both himself and his family, he had staged his disappearance, knowing that enemies within the Philippines and abroad were closing in on him. He had received information from multiple sources, both domestic and foreign, that indicated he was no longer safe. The combination of pressure from international powers, the threat of prosecution from the International Criminal Court, and internal political unrest had left him with no choice but to take drastic action. Sara Duterte's speech, which had ignited a firestorm of controversy, was now understood in a new light. It became clear that her words were not just a call for justice, but a strategy to buy her father time and galvanize his supporters. By publicly hinting at the possibility of his death, Sara was playing a dangerous game, manipulating both the media and the public into believing a narrative that would keep her father safe. However, the truth also raised even more unsettling questions. If Duterte had indeed orchestrated his own disappearance, what was the next step? And if he had successfully hidden from the world for so long, what would it take for him to return to power? The mystery surrounding his disappearance had taken a new turn, and the game of political survival was far from over. In the final moments of the documentary, Sara Duterte stood once more before the public, poised to reveal the last, most unexpected truth of all. Rodrigo Duterte, her father, was alive. The speech that had sparked global curiosity, suspicion, and even fear was part of a larger strategy, a carefully calculated move in a high-stakes game of politics and survival. Sara's words, initially seen as a desperate plea for answers, were now understood as a deliberate ploy to shield her father from those who sought to eliminate him. The truth was that Duterte had been in hiding, not killed, and the revelation shattered the entire narrative surrounding his disappearance. Sara admitted that her father's decision to disappear was born out of necessity, fearing for his life. After learning of the international plots against him, Duterte had staged his vanishing act with the help of loyal allies within both the Philippines and abroad. He was in hiding, but still very much alive, carefully watching the unfolding events from the shadows. The speech Sara gave months ago, which had seemed like an emotional outburst, was now revealed to be a calculated move to buy her father time, rally his supporters, and draw attention away from his true whereabouts. By allowing the world to believe that he had been targeted for death, she had set the stage for his eventual return. But the final twist came with an even more chilling revelation. Duterte wasn't just hiding, he was planning his comeback. The forces that had tried to destroy him, both domestic and foreign, had underestimated his ability to adapt and survive. Sara's admission left the world on edge. Would Rodrigo Duterte return to the political arena? And if so, what kind of leader would he be after all that had transpired? The disappearance had been a strategic move, but it was far from the end of his story. In fact, it was just the beginning of a new chapter, one that promised to reshape the Philippines and possibly the global political landscape once again. The mystery of Duterte's disappearance had not only revealed the lengths to which the powerful would go to silence a leader, it had opened the door to a new, even more dangerous political game.